Tonight, are we becoming a crueler country? Are you struggling to find a place to live? Is intergenerational wealth risking social unrest? And if you're a migrant, when can you call Australia home? Welcome to Q&A. Hello, I'm Stan Grant. A lovely Canberra welcome. We're live in Canberra. Thank you so much for coming out here to the Street Theatre. It's so good to see so many of you here in the theatre. We're going to answer all of your questions tonight. A lot of questions, of course, about the budget, with our co-founder of Think Forward, Sonia Arakkal, Shadow Finance Minister Jane Hume, author and journalist George Megalogenis, Independent MP for Fowler, Di Lee, and Finance Minister Katy Gallagher. Please make them welcome. Also tonight, the data dilemma. Should big business pay a ransom to cyber criminals? And a reminder, you can live stream us around the country on iView, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. Quanda is the hashtag. We want you all to get involved and we'll get to all your budget questions shortly. Let's begin though with a late breaking news story, and here is a question from Kathy Watson. Kathy?
The Prime Minister has been accused of bullying Michelle Landry in Parliament today. The Prime Minister said that his comments were aimed at Peter Dutton. This appears to be confirmed by Hansard. Does the panel consider that these comments were bullying, regardless of who the comments were aimed at?
Katy Gallagher.
Thanks, and thanks for the question. I've seen the news story. I haven't seen the footage of what happened in the House. Jane and I were in question time in the Senate. But I guess I can deal with it a couple of ways. One, I work very closely with the Prime Minister, and so I know his character and I know how he engages with people, and I can't for a moment think that he would have had any intention for his comments to be seen in any way, shape or form as bullying. I think the second thing I would say is Parliament is quite theatrical. I think question time in particular is theatrical. There's an element of robust engagement. I've just survived a couple of robust question times myself with, it's a different type of engagement that happens during that time. There's a lot of shouting, there's a lot of rhetoric, there's a lot of political arguments that go to and fro, and in a sense, we sign up to that a little bit in politics, that part of the day. The third thing I'd say is, and Jane and I are both involved in this, is we are implementing the Set the Standard report, which was a report done by Kate Jenkins into the last Parliament about looking at how we can improve conduct and behaviour across the Parliament as a whole, and I think there has been some significant change since the last Parliament, and we've got more work to do in that regard. But I think certainly from my point of view, and saying that I haven't seen the footage, but I can absolutely assure you, and I understand the Prime Minister has contacted Ms Landry to apologise at any offence that was caused, which is an appropriate thing to do. From working closely with Anthony, I just can't see in any way that would have been any attempt to bully or intimidate anybody.
Certainly not the way Michelle Landry saw it, because she said, today I was yelled at and screamed at across the chamber.
I was yelled at and screamed at across the chamber too today, Steph.
But by the Prime Minister and his colleagues. I did not expect the response I received from him and his colleagues. I felt intimidated and bullied. That's a female member of Parliament saying that she felt intimidated and bullied. Di Lee, you were there.
Yes.
How did you see it?
As a new member of Parliament, I remember when it first started, which is about probably 5 months ago, we were told that it's going to be a different Parliament, it's going to be more respectful, and since I've been in the chamber, I think it's anything but that in terms of, as I suppose I agree with the Finance Minister, that it is very theatrical. However, for a new person like myself, watching it, it was very obviously uncomfortable.
Did today cross the line, Di?
Look, I felt that I have seen, whether it's theatrical or not, but I've seen the Prime Minister very, aggressive in responding to questions. But I suppose it's a theatre. But like I said, as a newbie, you think, well, if people are watching it, and that's why people are more cynical about politicians, is because I think it shouldn't be treated as a theatre, but it is. And you're trying to kind of reconcile with, as a person who's there to represent a community, that I'm sure if you're in there as a community member, you think, well, aren't you actually having proper, robust debate, as opposed to having screaming at one another across the floor, which is different, screaming, because I don't think you can get anything across by talking to one another that way. You have to have proper debates. However, as I'm sure, the Shadow Finance Minister would probably support you that it is theatrical, but I said, as somebody who's new, I think it's not called for.
Jane Hume, have you spoken to Michelle Landry at all?
I haven't spoken to Michelle. We have, a WhatsApp chat, or what do you call it? Phone chat, and of course, all the women from the coalition sort of support each other. I have seen the footage, though. I actually saw it when I was up in the ABC studios getting my makeup done this afternoon, and I think the issue here is the proportionate response. Michelle was asking a very sensible question in question time. She was asking a question about the Rockhampton Ring Road, which she couldn't find in the budget. She wanted to know whether it was going to be cut, whether it was going to be delayed, or whether it was going to continue. And the response really wasn't proportionate. It was very shouty. Now, I understand that some people are saying, oh, well, is it the sort of theatre of Parliament? That's fine, but Michelle was very upset. She was asking a genuine question about her community, and she was asking it in a very quiet and measured way, and the response was disproportionate. Now, I take my hat off to Anthony Albanese. When he found out that Michelle was upset, he called her, and that was the right thing to do. But Daile's right. We were promised a more respectful and more civil parliament, a different kind of politics, I think was the words that were used this time around. And you've got to be able to walk that talk. You can't just say it, you've got to show it. So Katy's right, we are working together on implementation of the Jenkins Review, all of those recommendations that were commissioned and adopted under the previous Parliament by both sides of politics. And there is a change in the air. You can already feel it. It's a good thing. But old habits do die hard. And we need to keep working at it every single day. It's not just about legislating change, it's about living the change.
Sorry, Di.
I was going to say, look, I'm sure you both, because you've been there long enough to see some change.
Yeah,
but I think, as for somebody who's new, I actually have been observing politics from afar as a journalist previously. I don't think it has changed. It'll be interesting to see if people have seen the change in Parliament during Parliament time, question time.
The Speaker today did say that his view, there was no disrespect to Michelle Landry, so that was the Speaker's view of what happened. Let's move on, because we've got a lot of questions coming in, obviously, about the budget. I want to go to Robert Cash, and Robert is joining us via Skype. Robert, are you there? There you are.
Hi, Stan. How are you?
Now, I'm very well, Robert. You are, I understand, a Labor voter, but after the budget, you've got some questions about exactly what you voted for. Is that right?
I have, Stan. I've got some really serious questions that I think need to be answered, like tonight, if possible.
And okay, well, we've got someone to answer them. Katy's sitting right here. She's from the government. She's the finance minister. So away you go, Robert.
Right. Okay. Katy, I believe the overwhelming reason people turned to the ALP was that the middle class and the poor were tired of a government kicking the can down the road like it will be better this year or next year or the years to come, while corporate excesses were rife and people were going without. My question is, isn't this just a continuation under the new government of what we've had to put up with in the last 10 years? And where was the cost of living help that we needed on Tuesday night?
Katy.
Okay. So a couple of things there. I don't agree that it's just the same as what's been happening in the past. This budget, we tried to do three things. One was to deliver on our election commitments that we made before the last election, which we've done, was to provide sensible cost of living relief where we could without adding to the inflation problem that we're dealing with, particularly in the first 2 years of these forward estimates. And the third thing was to do a spending audit, which I was in charge of, which was to find some savings in the budget to start working towards some budget repair, which we also need to deal with for good reason, in the sense that we've got $1 trillion of debt, and managing that debt is the fastest growing program in the government budget.
And Katy, that's the government's dealing with that debt, it's dealing with its deficit, it's dealing with its budget bottom line, but so are families. And it was very clear from the Treasurer, and he said this very explicitly, that the indebted and the less well off are going to have to carry the heavy load. They're already paying more for their mortgages. They're going to have energy increases up to 50%. They're not going to get a pay rise in wage in line with inflation for another 18 months to 2 years. So it is a tough time ahead. And clearly people like Robert are saying there's not enough help.
Well, I think the difference that we're trying to deal with now, which is when we've looked at sort of some of the global uncertainty and some of the downturns we've had in the past, particularly the GFC, the COVID-19 pandemic, the response from government, and it was right to have it, was around providing stimulus to households. What we're dealing with at the moment, in the short term, certainly the first 2 years, is this inflation challenge. So what we've had to do is look at what's the responsible thing to do. We've got the Reserve Bank increasing interest rates to try and temper inflation, bring it back down. What is the responsible thing? Where can the government meaningfully help? The first decision we took was that we needed to support the work of the Reserve Bank, not make the inflation job, inflation work and make worse and make the Reserve Bank's job harder. In which case, so we looked at cost of living, where can we make a difference? So we looked at things like childcare, things like PPL, things like investing in skills, things like getting on with the energy transformation.
None of those things, with respect, right now is going to help someone pay a mortgage when they're paying $800 more now on a $500,000 mortgage than they were paying a few months ago, when they're having to put fuel in the car, to deal with energy prices. All the things you're talking about are further down the line. Can I go to you, George, though?
Well, can I just finish by saying the worst thing the government could have done was indiscriminately splash around cash. Like, that is the worst thing. It's hard to say that because people are really feeling the pinch, and it's a different type of response that we've had to previous downturns, but we are dealing with a different set of problems, and the problem at the moment is inflation, and if we just chucked a whole lot of money out the door, we would add to that problem and make the problem worse, and that would hurt households further.
Explain this, George, because that can sound very harsh to people, saying, I know you're suffering under high inflation, but you're going to suffer because if we give you money, it's only going to make it worse. How can we have a situation, George, where the budget bottom line is improving and people's lives are going backwards?
The budget's obviously improved in the short run because of inflation. So inflation is adding to revenue. But when you have an inflation outbreak, and we haven't had one now this is the first one in 30 years, and there isn't anyone in the Parliament with a memory of the last inflation crisis. And Australia's inflation crisis began to bubble in the late 60s, and it popped out of the box with the oil shock in 73, brought down the Whitlam government in 75, and it ran all the way through the early 1990s, and it took us 10 years longer than everybody else to knock inflation off, to knock it on their head and to put it back in, put the genie back into the bottle.
And we remember at the time how people hurt at the time, how high it got.
Well, interest rates had to go to the point where it not just knocked off inflation, it brought on a deep recession. So the tricky thing now, so this is the thing that the Reserve Bank and the government, and I know that the Treasurer and the Reserve Bank Governor talk to each other, and the Treasury Secretary is in that conversation as well. The least worst option for the government is a soft landing for the economy, that they go from 3% growth to 1.5% growth when the rest of the world crashes. And that is that, 1 is the new black, or 0 even is the new black, and we don't have a minus sign. But then if even with a slowdown you need inflation to come down, there's no guarantee that inflation comes down with a slowdown.
Well, in the budget they're saying it'll peak in December and start to come off. You don't necessarily think that's the case?
Like I say, if you look at the backstory, the last time we had inflation crisis, which in a way was imported, like the Americans brought inflation onto the rest of the world because they ran the Vietnam War on the credit card, it took us 20 years to get out of that trap. So in the short run, the Reserve Bank has to increase interest rates up until the point where it thinks it's a bit like chemotherapy, right? Up until the point at which you think you're not going to destroy the body. Like you're trying to knock off these cancers, but if you keep going, you're going to kill the patient. So that's the thing that they're trying to juggle at the moment. Now, in terms of what's on the kitchen table for people, in terms of the cost of living, the government has, and it sort of can't spell this out for you. I know Katy has sort of gone there, but can't take it to the nth degree, which is the pain has to be shared, because the worst thing we can do for you is to con you in the short term that this extra check is going to help you deal with inflation.
Hold that thought, George, because we're going to come back to a lot of this, and I want to bring you in, Sonia, because the point you made then is a relevant one. The pain has to be shared. In your view, is it being shared if the poorest and the most indebted are carrying the heaviest load?
Absolutely not, and we really see that in this budget. I think there are some cost of living, help for particular parts of society, and at Think Forward, I come to this from an intergenerational perspective. And I know, there's eligibility for the seniors' health card has changed. There's the freezing of the deeming rates, and of course, the pension is indexed to CPI. There's nothing for young people. There's nothing for rent assistance. There's nothing for youth allowance, for job seeker, the things that help young people, young working people, and those that are super vulnerable to adjust to the cost of living pressures. I don't see that. And then I see where there are budgetary helps for people, it's almost the same old story of politicians chasing the grey vote and not sending the money to where it actually needs to go, to people like Robert and his concerns.
We were going to go to Marcus Harrington a bit later, but you've raised young people. Marcus, are you here? Marcus Harrington. Can you stand up, Marcus? So how old are you, Marcus?
22.
22. You're working?
Yes, full-time.
When you looked at the budget and you hear what Sonia has to say, does that ring true to you as a young person?
Absolutely. Even before inflation, we already saw Medicare levies were at a higher threshold for older people. We saw, I believe, other forms of tax offset for older people. Older people are more likely to own their own home. They're more likely to own the investment properties that people my age are having to rent, and rents aren't being frozen or being, as Sonia pointed out, no extra assistance. So young people are feeling the pinch, and wage growth just isn't increasing in line with all that.
Katy.
Yeah, well, I think if you look at the budget, there is actually one of the biggest increases in the budget, going to your point, was about $33 billion increase in payments, which does include payments for young people and for job seekers. So there was that adjustment, and a pretty significant adjustment at that. I think in other areas, I look at university places, I look at the investment in skills, I look at the housing accord. The first time for a long time that the Commonwealth has gone, you know what, we have a responsibility in housing, not just in signing off a deal with the states and territories on the housing and homelessness agreement, but actually being actively involved in affordable rental stock and coming to the table on that. Climate. I mean, there's it's actually more than $21 billion in investments in the transformation that's happening across our economy right now to get moving with that. The young people have a huge stake in that. So I don't accept that this budget was framed with a particular demographic in mind. It wasn't. It was set against a very challenging set of economic circumstances. I accept that, which meant that we had to show restraint and be very considered in the decisions we've taken. But within that, we have massive investments in climate, in housing, in skills, in university, in schools. I mean, these are the areas the Commonwealth can invest sensibly.
Absolutely, but I think it's really important that we see young people's issues as economic issues, and whether that's what Marcus was talking about in terms of rent assistance. The housing accord is great, but that might only wait till 2024. Me and a lot of my friends, we have landlords ringing us up and saying, we're increasing your rent by $100, and that's conservative. I've had some horror stories from mates of mine talking about the kinds of rent increases they're going to need over the next 12 months, and what's in the budget for those people?
Well, again, I think, with the Commonwealth, where we pay for rent assistance, it is in the social housing sector. We don't subsidise rent outside of the social housing sector and
those with
public
youth allowance
housing
also
sector.
get rent assistance. So people on youth allowance aren't getting any extra support to adjust to the costs of living, and so they're not going to get any extra support with the rent assistance as well.
Well, I think the decision we've taken, the Commonwealth does provide support in rent assistance. We have a big increase in payments. We've got a big increase going out the door into community organisations to meet their costs. Many of those services are provided to young people in need. And then we have these other areas of the budget where we are making investments for the long term. I mean, we've come into government, we've had 5 months. We've put together a budget which is primarily around delivering election commitments, dealing with urgent and unforeseen things that happen, like Ukraine, COVID, floods, and cleaning up some of the legacy issues we were left by the previous government. So this budget should be seen as the first in a series of things. But we've had 9 years of neglect that we are having to deal with
Jane,
here.
I'll give you a chance to respond in just a minute. Let's bring in our third question here, our next questioner. It's Alessio Lewington. Alessio?
Thank you. The Albanese Government promised $275 cuts to electricity bills in their campaign. This budget confirms these bills will go up by 50% over the next 2 years. This will have a significant impact on households. What are we going to do to mitigate these costs?
Hold that thought, Katy.
I thought you were going to come straight to me.
You're the finance minister now. You're holding the can. But I'll go to you, Di, because the things that Alessio is talking about, you're seeing, aren't you, in your electorate?
Yes,
How are
right.
people dealing with this crisis at the moment?
And I mean, I come from and I think you've mentioned it in your piece at the ABC Stand about the low to middle income earners in electorates like mine in Fowler. They're very on low income, and so they are struggling with electricity price rise, gas price, rent rises, interest rise. And one of the things I ask for the government to do is that to extend the excise fuel cut of 22 cents, which will keep the petrol prices down, because the majority of our community, I don't know what's like in Canberra, but definitely in Fowler, the majority of families still drive to work, long distance to work. They still use petrol cars. They drop the kids off at school. They drive their elderly parents shopping and all that. But the Treasurer said to me that it was going to be costing them $3 billion. So therefore they can't afford yet they can give $243 billion tax cut to those who are earning $200,000 and above. So
we're certainly going to get to stage 3 of tax cuts as well.
So I'm just thinking, well, how can you justify that? When people are in need of that daily living is what's needed most.
Jane, I'll bring you in here because when we look at energy in particular, and the crisis of seeing such steep increases and the energy transition, doesn't this come back to what has often been referred to as the lost decade, and that the inheritance of this government from the failure to act in the previous, yours?
Well, let's take a step back, Stan. The government promised not once, but 97 times in the lead up to the election that it would cut energy bills by $275. Now, the moment that the election was over, we heard nothing more about $275. And less than 6 months later, not only has that promise clearly been abandoned, but we're now seeing...
Well, it hasn't actually, because Anthony Albanese is still sticking by it.
Well, actually, Jim Chalmers said it was still in the budget, but then he changed his mind. What we're seeing is energy prices going up by electricity prices by more than 50%, gas prices by more than 40%. Now,
but again, you come back to this. Had there been more action earlier, would we be at a point where we wouldn't be necessarily seeing this impact because we would have transitioned precisely to the point where Prime Minister Albanese says where you will see those reductions?
I am very glad you asked this question, Stan, because in the last 2 years of a coalition budget, we actually saw energy bills go down. And you don't need to take my word for it. It was actually in an ACCC report that came out in December last year that energy bills had gone down. Now, we believe in a net zero emissions world. We want to see emissions reduced. You can laugh all you like, but we've committed to it. And not only have we committed to it, but when we were in government, that emissions reduction was, affordability was also at the heart of a low emissions policy.
George, you were looking very sceptical.
Hang on. You can look as sceptical as you like, but what we're seeing now is the rush to replace all existing baseload power, the reliable power, the cheaper power, the affordable power, with renewables at a rate that is so fast that we're seeing price shocks.
George.
Where do you want me to start?
That is such
So
rubbish.
we can't, I mean...
Start first of all on why we are seeing these increases now, and could we have got there faster if we'd seen more action previously?
Well, obviously, the last 9 years matter a lot. The last 9 years matter a lot because up until the death, really, when the Prime Minister went to Glasgow, talk of even net zero by 2050 wasn't on the agenda. Now, the coalition spent, through 3 Prime Ministers, the one in the middle did try to do something about it but lost his job because of it, the coalition spent 3 terms assuming that climate change is really just a game you could play politics with, that there wouldn't be a reckoning for Australia, that you wouldn't get the fire, the flood, the flood, the flood and the flood. So we're now in a world that feels like the beginning of not just, from a position of strength. We might price carbon 10 years ago, we might have a transition going by now. Now we're in this living in the teeth of the crisis. And because we are the country that the rest of the world looks at and says, "Oi, you guys haven't had a recession for 28 years leading up to COVID. You've got this great minerals bounty. You've got the wealthiest middle class on the planet. Why couldn't you sort this out?" Hang on, I've got to get... No, that's all right. I need a break and I need to go, because we did reduce emissions by 20% at a time when the economy has doubled in size. We were not just meeting our Paris targets, but we were beating our Paris targets, and we did commit to net zero by 2050. But I didn't want to get a political exchange with you. We did it in a sensible way, in a measured way, that isn't causing your power bills to go up the way they are now. Just hold on. So I don't want to get in a political exchange, and I'll just... Again, let's just try and stick with, because we all know what happened the last 9 years. And the last 9 years, and Jane, you wouldn't be one of the ones that was pulling the lever for denial. I know that for a fact. But the last 9 years are very difficult for this country because people went to work with the best intentions in the public service. People went to work with the best intentions in industry. People went to work with the best intentions in the community sector, but got yelled down because this idea of, well, it's politics. And we who run this country can say, climate change doesn't matter. Now that is... Now we know who they are, right? We can name them. So Tony Abbott, starts with Tony Abbott. Tony Abbott went into government thinking he could knock off a price on carbon, minerals tax, mineral super profits tax, which the mining companies signed up for, right? So it'd still be rolling into the budget today. Those things got knocked off because apparently you could do things without having to pay for them. But here we are now, and the question to you now, Katy Gallagher, is what are you going to do? If people are going... Can you afford your electricity prices to go up 50% in the next 2 years? No, you can't.
No, exactly. Okay. Yeah.
Mine aren't, because I'm from Western Australia.
Well, this is exactly where we're going to get to.
And the point is here in the ACT, where we've signed up to 100% renewable energy, which I did when I was Chief Minister and has been implemented by Andrew Barr.
Prices
have gone backwards by 1% in the last year. This is the whole point.
And I want to come to that point about the differentiation between the states, but there's been talk of intervention. And what will that intervention look like? Will it be a cash handout, the sort of thing we heard earlier that people are saying they need to get through this? How do you do that without making it inflationary? Or do you cap prices? What does an intervention look like?
Well, the petrol price excise cut is actually not inflationary. I think there would have been a small measure from my perspective.
But for energy, Katy, right now? Because there has been talk about intervention.
Fuel prices have actually eased, and the point about fuel excise and keeping that going was more about sustainability in the long term and on the budget. We have a budget in structural deficit. We have high debt.
But the question is the question is intervention into energy prices. It's been raised.
What we're doing,
what's it going to look like?
Yeah. Okay. So on that question, and I guess I would like to respond to some of the issues Jane has, but I'm going to withhold. I'm going to hold myself back on that. Yeah. Okay. On intervention and looking at what is possible now, I think the Treasurer has made clear we are looking at all options. I think we're not wanting to favour one over the other. I think when we're looking at things, if it's possible, and we have to work with the states and territories on this because the states and territories have many of the levers, so it's not something that the Commonwealth can unilaterally do on its own. So discussions need to happen there. I think we would, looking at what regulatory steps are available is probably more where we would go in the first instance rather than cash handouts.
Regulatory means supply. Again, is it a price cap? What does it look like?
Well, people have nominated a whole range of things that could be considered there. I don't think at this point in time, I think the message from the government is we understand that these big increases in prices are very, very difficult for households, for major manufacturers and for small business. We understand that completely. A responsible government would then consider what are the options available to us to help alleviate some of that pressure, what's the right thing to do in terms of the economic circumstances, and the other thing we need to do, and we have to acknowledge that the war in Ukraine is actually a factor here and how it's wreaking havoc in energy markets around the world. We're not immune to that. And so we need to get on and implement our Powering Australia plan, which is fully funded in the budget to get more renewables into the grid.
There will be intervention. You're just looking at what
well, we're looking at options.
Okay.
I'm not saying that we've got any... No, I can't agree that there will be intervention. What I'm saying is we are doing what responsible governments do in looking at what options are available to us, including regulatory steps that could be taken to ease some of these pressures in light of the increases. We've inherited, and I have to make this point, we have inherited this because I know Jane wants to park it all with us.
We've made this point, but look, can I stop it there?
It's an important point because we're getting criticised for a situation that we've inherited after 9 years of neglect. We've got 5 months in and we're absolutely genuinely trying to deal with it.
Well, I want to come to the next question, but just to address that was raised here and your point as well, Sonia, about the difference in the states. George, really quickly if you can, why we see someone like Western Australia keep energy increases at line with inflation? Why is Queensland doing better? What can we take away from that federally?
Most state governments basically handed over public monopolies into the private sector and lost two things. They lost ability to control price and they also lost the dividend. Yeah. Now, in good times, the sort of deregulation of the energy sector led to lower prices, and Jane's point's right about the last couple of years. But in a global crisis like the one we're in now, a state government like WA is laughing at the rest of the country because 10 years ago they took a decision. Firstly, they didn't privatise, but because they didn't privatise, and this is something that's underestimated, I think, certainly in the Commonwealth, because the Commonwealth doesn't run many things anymore, there's no governing memory and there's no on-the-ground memory or understanding of how markets work because they're not in markets anymore. In WA, they understood something that the eastern states could probably, especially Victoria and New South Wales, I mean, the energy market in Victoria is busted and New South Wales is not far behind. In a way, because the Commonwealth sort of wears the blame because it didn't get to... Energy is a different issue to climate change in my head, right?
But doesn't that have to do with the gas
reservation policy?
So you hold back something for the local market.
There's something WA understood and also exercised the power of the state. Basically told the people, if you're going to be taking this, the people of WA's resources, I'm going to let you make a buck, but there will be a point in this negotiation where you can't rip off my voters. Okay. And that's the guts of it. And the Commonwealth are looking for a version of this, but they don't have quite either the know-how or the leadership.
WA has a 15% reservation policy, so that means that
keeps that back for the domestic market.
It's not all going to China, Japan, and Korea. The people where the assets are, where the resources are, get the benefit of the companies that operate in their communities.
Let's get to our next question from Ian Townsend. Ian.
My question is to Jane Hume. Why is the Coalition so obsessed with maintaining an election promise rather than dealing with a changed reality? Surely it is better to look after the welfare of all Australians rather than a promise to give high earners a tax break.
Ian, and what you're referring to are the stage 3 tax cuts, particularly for the people earning 200,000.
Absolutely.
Ian, thank you for your question. The stage 3 tax cuts are part of a 3-part plan to reduce personal income taxes. Now, Australia is one of the highest personal income taxing nations in the world. In the Coalition, we believe that individuals are better placed to spend their own money. They probably spend their own money better than governments do. And we think that people that work hard, that earn money, that save money, that invest money, deserve to keep more of their own money when they can.
Does someone earning $200,000 a year need another $9,000 as a windfall when we've heard that people are struggling to pay their everyday cost of living expenses?
Now, we know we still have a very progressive tax system. We're not getting rid of the highest tax bracket. Anybody that earns over $200,000...
But I'm talking about someone with $200,000
yes,
getting $9,000 extra in their pay packet
they're
each
also
year.
paying significantly more tax
but no,
than
I'm saying,
somebody that
do you think
is at
that
the
that's
lower
fair
end.
right now? That
Well,
looks
we have
to
a progressive tax system, and can we be fair here, Stan? The government has also adopted the stage 3 tax cuts. Now, yes, we are pressuring them to keep them because we believe, particularly when they kick in, that it is the worst possible time to increase taxes. When people are suffering from a cost of living crisis, why on earth you would then take more of their money away from them? I cannot understand.
I'll ask the audience, what do you think? The government says that it doesn't want to break a promise and therefore it's still committed to these stage 3 tax cuts. Do you think it's reasonable now for the government to break that promise? Hands up. Quite a few don't. Katy Gallagher, are you going to stick with them?
The government hasn't changed its position on stage 3. They come into effect in 2 years' time. I have to say in this budget we have focused on the immediate pressing priorities of what's happening right now, and I think if you look over the forward estimates, it really is these 2 years where we're dealing with the high inflation and some of the pressures that we're seeing now. So this budget has been focused on the short term. I think what Jim and I have tried to do, Jim Chalmers and I, the Treasurer, in putting this budget together, is to lay bare for everybody some honesty in government budgeting. Because I don't think we've had that for some time. So we have shown very clearly what some of those pressures are. We've acknowledged the budget remains in structural deficit and will until we make some adjustments. So part of that conversation, has to be around all aspects of the budget. That includes revenue and spending. We have, if anyone reads the budget papers, and I'll forgive you if you haven't, in the last 2 days, there's a lot of the books, but if you look over the medium term, the pressures from spending on services that we all value, aged care, hospitals, the NDIS, defence, they're 4 of the top 5.
You're not going to raise enough taxes to pay for it all. Programs.
Well, we're being upfront with people about that, what that looks like over the medium term, particularly the NDIS, I have to say, when you look at it. People value that, they want to see it, they want to see those investments, so we have to have a discussion about what we value and how we pay for it, and we are up for that discussion.
Sonia, what was it, $250 billion the tax cuts are being costed at?
253, I think they've been adjusted, yep.
Wouldn't it be good to, Sonia, to use that somewhere else rather than go ahead with them?
Look, I think we need to not be, when we have new information available to us around what's happening in the economy, it makes sense that we stop and think about what we might have committed to before and adjust it for what we're projecting in the future. Nobody wants a broken promise, but intelligence is reassessing your opinions when new information becomes available. And that's what we want to see in our tax system, intelligence. And it's not just around the stage 3 tax cuts. There's a broader conversation we need to have. When we talk about intergenerational fairness, it's not about bashing baby boomers, talking about avocado toast. It's really about tax reform, who we tax and why. And especially not just how we tax earned income, but how we tax unearned income. And the conversations that we have around wealth taxes is a really important one, and one I really hope is something that governments will have the courage to have. And if we have a structural deficit, as Katy has said, and there's a lot of allusion to these difficult conversations, but I'm not actually seeing them happening yet. And I think...
We're having it right now.
Yeah.
We're doing it right now.
And
5 months into a government, we're doing it.
I know that the government has also talked about having the $50 billion windfall from commodities. They're not touching
tax
that.
revenue.
The $243 billion, tax cut that they've given those who can, don't have to have the tax cut, but can, they give that to them. And I think that, if you look at people who are on $65,000 to under $129,000 income, they are going to be bear the brunt, as you said, Stan, in terms of they're going to spend more, definitely, because they have to buy food every day, groceries, pay for petrol. They are spending more. And what the government is trying to do is make them stop spending, and those who can afford to spend can spend. So, and the family is going to try to go to work, put food on the table. Yes, they offer this cheaper childcare for those who've got children under 5. However, what about kids who have to go to after-school care? That hasn't been taken into consideration. So it's just, for me, the tax, the cost of living support that the government claim to have given is not really the majority, the millions of hard-working class Australians that I know. Is very, very, very small, target group.
We have to move on. If you're just joining us, you're watching Q&A live with Sonia Arakkal, Jane Hume, George Megalogenis, Daly and Katy Gallagher. Our next question is on an issue so many of you have been caught up in this past week or so, in fact, perhaps over the past year. Here's Israel Machuka.
Thanks, Dan. In light of the recent Medibank cyber attack, my question to the panel is, what do governments have any control over cyberspace?
George, can government possibly control cyberspace?
Can they control cyberspace? Xi Jinping thinks you can control cyberspace in China. If there's something we could learn...
Is that something we want to emulate? I'm not sure.
If there's something you could learn from him. No, I don't think governments can control cyberspace, but business should have anticipated their vulnerability. And in fact, I don't want to lump all of corporate Australia in together, but the conversations we're having around inflation, around inequality, around the purpose of the budget, around how we tax people and what we spend our money on, the money that's raised in taxes on. Corporate Australia has been in sort of the easy lane for a long, long time in public life, and both these hacks, Optus and now Medibank Private, you would want, in fact, if you were the minister, you'd want the CEO into your office right away and figure out what the hell had gone wrong and have them take responsibility, obviously on behalf of their customers, but more importantly on behalf of the state and on behalf of the country. So I don't think whether governments can control these things or not, I think you need at some level to put fire under corporate Australia to make sure that they look after you a bit better.
And Jane Hume, this is why we see harsher penalties for breaches or companies that are not putting in the right security procedures around that. Is that enough?
Well, the coalition government invested record amounts in cyber security, but it really is an all-of-community issue. Everything from your personal computer and your phone right through to these big corporates and, of course, big government as well. One of the things that I was very concerned about was seeing around $5 million cut from our cyber security strategy in the budget only on Tuesday night, even while all of this was going on. Now, my colleague James Patterson has pointed this out and has asked the Home Affairs Minister, Claire O'Neill, what on earth she was thinking, taking money out of cyber security at a time when there is heightened awareness and heightened risk.
Yeah.
Israel, you were caught up in this, is that right? Yeah. What happened in your case?
Well, not entirely sure, because we keep getting emails that are not very clear in terms of the extent of the impact and the information that's involved. But it gets to a point where it's not just the Medibank emails, but it's also other companies which might be worried about their own security and reassuring. So I get ones from my mobile provider, from every other kind of organisation that might have some of my data saying, hey, this is what we're doing, and it gets to a point where you're just getting so many emails.
Are you worried right now too?
Well, yeah, a bit, but also I think to George, your point about, you know, lighting a fire under businesses and organisations and that it's their responsibility. Looking at the OAIC's last report in terms of eligible data breaches, 60% or so of the incidents were due to malicious or criminal activity. So they are also victims, I guess, and it's trying to understand how, you know, you don't just lump organisations as bearing 100% of the responsibility.
Yeah, I actually get that. So then the question is, as a public, what level of government surveillance intervention to guard your data, but they basically get to...
Look, we don't want surveillance.
No, that's
But there is more government can be doing. And in fact, the penalties that currently exist are too low, the ones that your government set. And your government only prosecuted one cybersecurity breach, one, enforce the penalties. The penalties need to be higher, and the OAIC needs to be invested in, and those penalties need to be enforced.
There's also a question here, Katy, about whether you know, the old line about having to deal with terrorists. I mean, it applies here to cybersecurity as well. Do you pay a ransom? Say, for instance, MyGov was hacked, or a security, something that was a high priority for the government. At what point do you have to then entertain negotiation and perhaps paying a ransom?
Well, I think to deal with that question specifically, you know, it's difficult without having, you know, I guess in a sense we're dealing with a hypothetical situation here.
But it can become very real, as we know, can't it?
But as a rule, you know, I think negotiating with criminals is difficult. Like, you know, I'm not sure that they necessarily hold to a deal, for example. You know, and this is one of the problems. So I don't think, certainly from the government's point of view, you know, paying ransom for cyber hacks or cyber crimes, you know, isn't something that we would go down the path of easily without, you know, and again, hypothetical situation, it depends what's at stake. But I think as a general rule, I think the issue of penalties is real, and we've got some legislation to deal with that in light of Optus and the Medibank one that came into the Parliament. There's more work to do across government, definitely, and we have invested. In fact, there's quite a bit of money going into cybersecurity across government, including for some programs that were only partly funded, Senator Hume. And I think the other thing is the digital identity. This is the other big piece, which is some work that started under the former government in 2015. You know, COVID's happened, and so things haven't probably progressed as they should. But this is the next discussion we need to have, which is so you don't have to provide your part potentially under a digital identity, that you don't have to provide a whole range of information to prove who you are, that you have a digital identity, and so that information isn't necessarily stored and then hacked into. But I know Australians will have a view on...
Sounds a bit like the surveillance from before.
Well, no. And this is the problem with this. Like, you know, we have this even with the My Health record and stuff like this. Oh my, you know, we can't have this electronic thing because it's all, you know, this is a new scary world where currently, you know, on the paper-based system in the health system, you could have 5 doctors and they've got all your information in paper files in their filing cabinet, which is.
But Katy, you can understand, given what's happened with Optus, Medibank, everyone feels a little bit uncomfortable with the ability to safely secure this information.
Which is the point of the digital identity,
yeah,
is that you don't have that information. But I agree, it warrants a national conversation. The states and territories are very keen on it. The private sector's keen on it too, because they will move and create their own one, so they don't have these paper-based identity systems. And the question is, do we want one national one, or do we want a whole range of other state and territory schemes and private schemes that exist, and we all have 8 numbers? But I think that's where it's
whoever
heading.
runs them protect that information from malicious actors.
Which is why people want the Commonwealth to run it, so it's one system with the protections around it. But
knowing what I know
about... In an ever-increasingly digital world that we're living in, I think... individually, I think we need to be very careful with how we use data or use our technology, because we're on it constantly. And I think that's our responsibility. But also, definitely the government has to step in and ensure that big corporations take a role and play a role in ensuring that the information that we give them is also protected. And if they breach that, definitely they have to actually face a very steep fine so that they can actually maintain that safe security.
There's a whole program in this, and I'm sure we'll do one on this actually.
Yeah.
I think it deserves an entire program. But let's move on now. Kaim Shah is joining us. Kaim.
Thank you, Stan. My name is Hume. I'm from Afghanistan, being in Australia for 10 years on a bridging visa. So the waiting and uncertainty is causing me distressing. Separation from my family is caused me depressing and anxiety. So I done MBA, so I came to would like to work as a professional accountant. But being that I have a bridging visa, I cannot work in my field. So I started my own business, creative jobs, contributing in the economy, like pay taxes, but I'm not entitled to any Medicare. So if I would like to buy a house or extend my business, I can't do it. Because of, again, I have a bridging visa, temporary bridging visa. Australia's statistics say we have 20,000 refugees or asylum seekers from 2000, but they haven't been processed in 20 years. So my question is, why does Australia treat asylum seeker unfairly and inhumane in this modern world? Thank you.
Thank you for sharing your story. Just to give I came here as a refugee, so I know the struggle of trying to, learn the language, adapt to this new society, and rebuild your life. So absolutely. I've spoken with the Asylum Seeker Resource Centre, who've told me about the number of asylum seekers on bridging visa. And I think that the government, this is a great opportunity for the government to really, especially with the workforce shortages, to ensure that many of these asylum seekers can actually contribute and participate into our economy now, as we talk about workforce shortages. So I think it's very critical, and I know that today that one of our independent crossbenchers have put in a petition from the Asylum Resource Centre calling for the government to recognise the skills and the qualification of the asylum seekers so that we can actually address workforce shortages.
Jane, Kaim was here throughout your government's term in office, and here he is saying he's done everything right, a job, contributed to the society, doesn't have a Medicare card, can't buy a house, can't work, doesn't in his field, can't have security. We should hang our heads in shame at a situation like this, shouldn't we?
Well, first of all, can I say thank you for coming to our country and contributing the way that you have. I think that gives us great heart.
Shouldn't we now return the favour?
And also, I'm terribly sorry about what's going on in your own country. It does sound like it is very sad for so many of your fellow countrymen, and that does break my heart. And this is your stories of the stories that we're hearing from over there. Are quite common. And
but Kaim wants to know now. This is his country now.
I understand that you're here on a bridging visa. I don't know the circumstances in which you came to the country, other than that you came seeking asylum. And for that, I'm very glad that we could offer you that asylum. Now, the fact that you haven't been able to get a visa beyond that, I don't know the circumstances around that. Why that has taken so long, without knowing your personal circumstances, I really, really can't give you any comfort, other than to say that we have a very strict border policy in this country for good reason, and it's not something that we should shy away from. Because we have a strong border policy, it allows us to take in more refugees, to accommodate more people. A really well-managed immigration policy allows us to do that. And that's been the foundation of a strong economy for many years. And it's not something that we should shy away from. But that said, we should make sure that we embrace people that want to contribute to our society and that we look after them well because they have chosen to come here.
Katy, the question that Kaim posed is, why does Australia treat asylum seekers so unfairly? And this is coming from someone who is committed to 10 years in this country. Can you look at Kaim and tell him why?
Well, thank you for asking your question. And I have to say this is an area where we've inherited a mess from the previous government, and we are working through it. Like,
couldn't you fix that now by committing to supporting Chaim and expediting his case?
Well, I don't know your individual case, but I do know what we're doing. I do know what we're doing as a government, which is, and you'll see it in the budget papers, we're putting a huge additional investment into the immigration part of Home Affairs to process the more than 2.6 million visas applications that we inherited when we came into government. It is a massive mess.
Katy,
So
we had closed borders for 2 years. Come on.
Well, I think for people who were here, there were hundreds of thousands of applications for people who were here, that there could have been some progress made on that. I don't accept it was just COVID related. I do accept that you were obsessed with Operation Sovereign Borders.
You know what we're doing?
At the expense
we're
of others.
talking
program that you have adopted.
No, I'm sorry.
but I'm
Can I
saying
stop? Because you're talking past the man who asked the question.
Well, no,
and you're
I'm not.
talking to
I'm
each
not,
other.
Stan.
No, you are.
No, I'm
Chaim,
not.
you have something to say?
So I came as a student. I didn't come even by board, for just your government say. And this is my document. It's a full of the documents. I work with the USAID. I work with the World Bank project as a finance manager in Afghanistan, which is Taliban was targeting. We, in Afghanistan, we said, you coalition or Americans said, we are helping you. We need people we need education. For example, how many scholarship you given to Afghan when Australia force was there? 0. How many humanitarian visa you provided to Afghan? 0. So the people Afghan is like me as I came as a student and provide all the documents, do all the right thing, and still they misleading the people, telling the wrong thing. Oh, we have this process. Immigration, you wait for 10 years, 5 years, then they reject you, then you have to go tribunal. Tribunal is one person, is not in a few members. It's one lady, just reject you for anything. I provide as many, like this is full file. It's not one document. And she just rejected. Now I'm in like circuit court. I don't know my uncertainty. I work, I do my taxes, I do all right things, no criminal, no anything, but still why they treat me like that?
Chaim, thank you for bringing your story. I know we don't have a lot of time to go into the ins and outs, but Katy, can I get a commitment though, that there will be a follow-up to Chaim's case?
Oh, for sure. And I'm sorry if you felt like I was talking past you. There was no intention to do that at all. But absolutely, I will make sure that Minister Giles and we connect with him, with you. But on the broader point, we did make some commitments about dealing with people who had been on temporary protection visas for long periods of time, 10 years, certainly years, to convert those to more permanent arrangements. And we are doing that. But the point I was trying to make is we came in with a department that wasn't resourced, where there was this massive backlog in applications, and we are working through that, and that is funded in this budget because we rate it as such a top priority.
Okay, well, there is a commitment to follow up, and Chaim, you may be able to hear something from the government. We can get back in touch with you as well, so good luck with your situation. We're going to finish tonight's discussion with Margaret Peterson. Margaret? Hi, Margaret.
Hello. Thank you. There is a well-known ongoing crisis situation in aged care, especially in rural and regional areas. Aged care homes are closing with severe staff shortages. It is important that the aged are respectfully and well cared for and not forced to go to strange places far away from family and friends. What is being done about funding and training for nurses, doctors and allied staff, particularly in the regions?
Thank you. Again, we could do a whole program on this, and I'm sure we will, and the clock's racing against us today. But George, looking overall, and clearly in the budget, this was highlighted as one of the issues, that how do we meet these costs and all the training and so on that you've mentioned as well there, when we're also having to feeling the squeeze with the budget and having to raise more money.
Yeah, and I think, but certainly where aged care is concerned, this is something that's never going to run contrary to what the Reserve Bank's trying to do with inflation. I think we can afford to be generous, and if we've got deficits as far as the eye can see, and we've got a critical staff shortage and really, really awful care, like report after report after report, it's not something that we can say, park it, wait till we get inflation under control, wait till we see if the property market crash lands or has a soft landing. This should This is something we should be able to do now. And because it doesn't cut across the inflation management story, you should put the heat on the government to make sure that they not just honour the promise on wages, because they're obviously going to they're going to take, what, 5 billion or something, I think. I don't know what the number is. It's higher.
Well,
it's
maybe.
higher. It's higher.
Depends.
But this is an area, remember what we learnt during COVID? This is an area of Commonwealth responsibility that has been contracted out to the private sector, and it is the worst possible model you could have for care. Absolutely the worst possible model for care, and it is, I think, a national project to fix it.
Sonia.
No, like the whole point of our economy is that it underpins this process of mutual care between the generations, and we have to be looking after our elderly while kind of promoting the prosperity of our young, and that mutual care is the point of the economy. It's not about inflation or deficits, or it's about how do we sustain mutual care, not just for those of us living today, but for future elderly people and into the next crisis that might come.
Margaret, we are going to continue this conversation. We actually got Jim Chalmers with us next week, the Treasurer, on the program, so we'll be talking a lot about just precisely these issues. Unfortunately, the clock has wound down on us tonight. That's all we've got time for. Let's thank our panel again. Sonia Arakkal, Jane Hume, George Megalogenis, Di Lee, you can clap, and Katy Gallagher.
Thank you.
A big clap from me as well for all of you coming out tonight and sharing your stories and raising those important questions. So thanks for joining tonight's discussion. As I said, next week we're going to be talking to the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers. We'll be live in Sydney. That's a one-on-one special, so you'll have the Treasurer there for an hour. You won't be able to,
Jim.
Won't be able to. No, well, you know, I'm sure he's looking forward to it, Katy.
He will be. He will be.
He's delivered his first budget and he's ready to answer your questions. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of them. Do go to our website. You can register there to be in the audience. We do take video questions, so we want those as well. Not just your questions. We also want to know your stories, how you're dealing with this right now, what is directly affecting you. Now, after tonight's show, Indigenous lawyer and founder of the Cape York Institute, Noel Pearson, is delivering the first of his Boyer lectures titled Who We Were and Who We Can Be. That's going to explore the Voice to Parliament proposal. You can watch that here on ABC TV or iView. In the meantime, thanks again for our panel, the audience, for you at home. We'll see you again next week. Good night.